I'm Lisa Smith, your host for today. We have a terrific lineup of guests for you. We're talking about, a lot of times we hear about the bad things going on in the world, the toxic world that we live in. And we actually have some good news today. We have a lot of good news. And the first person who's going to tell us about some of this good news is Rebecca Shanberg. She has done a documentary called Do No Harm, which is about a doctor and an accountant, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
They worked, I think, at the same hospital in Georgia. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And they discovered that the hospital wasn't exactly fulfilling its legal and ethical obligations as a nonprofit. In fact, they were doing what? What was the hospital doing? And what was the name of the hospital again?
It's called Phoebe Putney Hospital. And they were overcharging uninsured people. They had a lot of money in their bank accounts, and they were overcharging uninsured people and bankrupting them.
So when you say overcharging, you mean they weren't giving them a discounted rate, or they were actually overcharging?
They weren't giving them a discounted rate at all. So they were charging them what you would pay if you had absolutely no support at all from an insurance company. And
as a nonprofit, they get, millions and billions in tax write-offs.
Tons of money off their tax write-offs.
So part of their mission is to provide some care.
Exactly, to take care of the poor in their community.
Now, I thought it was very interesting in your film that one of the, one of the heroes of your film, I believe it was the accountant, mentions that, or maybe it was you in the voice, in the narrative, mentions that more than 50% of the bankruptcies in the U.S. are from people trying to, basically they're in a hole because they can't pay their medical bills.
One of the most scariest statistics that came out a couple of years ago, there was a Harvard study, and they discovered that medical bankruptcy causes this enormous percentage of bankruptcies in the country. And people don't really realize that, and it's coming, half of those people, or more than half, are actually insured. So it's not people who have no insurance. It's people who are underinsured or paying huge copays or have benefits that aren't good enough. And so they end up going into the hole and becoming bankrupt.
Well, let's get on to the story here. First, tell us about, I believe it's Charles Rindberg and Dr. Bagnato.
That's right, Charles Rayberg and Dr. Bagnato.
Rayberg. They seem in the movie like average guys. They don't seem like activists. In fact, they're like about the last people that you'd expect to become whistleblowers. What exactly did they do once they found out what their hospital was doing?
Well, they were kind of the unexpected heroes. I think they were working at a practice that was affiliated with a hospital. Dr. John Bagnato was a surgeon there. He's actually chief of surgery at one point. It's a large community hospital in a small town, in a small city, really.
How small is it? I mean, it looked like it might have been even a little rural.
It's the outlying areas are rural. It's 80,000 people, but the outlying areas are extremely rural, and it's the biggest hospital in Southwest Georgia. So it really serves several different counties, and these guys were trying to establish an independent practice, and the hospital barred them from doing that. So they started looking into the hospital's financial practices. And as a surgeon, Dr. Bagnato has a little bit of an ego, and he's quite a personality. But I wouldn't say that he was ever, he's a rebel, but he's not somebody you would think would take on the hospital he was working at necessarily. And Charles Rayberg is an accountant, and he's a very quiet guy. Lived in that town, grew up in that town, was born at that hospital, had no intention of stirring things up, likes to be in the background, incredibly shy person. And they basically took on this hospital and then brought everything they found much, much bigger than that to a national level. So
basically what your film is about, which is called Do No Harm, the film is about these two gentlemen who they take on the hospital, but they didn't start out that way. They started out sending a fax out anonymously about their research and about what they'd found out, and the hospital reacted and pretty much tried to crush them. You can tell us the details of that later, but what were some of the things that they found out that the hospital was doing, other than driving people into bankruptcy and overcharging?
Well, some of the craziest things that they found were that the hospital had enormous money that they were using for travel. They were taking taxpayer money, going on these luxurious trips, vacations, board retreats. They would go to the Cayman Islands, visit accounts that they had set up in the Cayman Islands, spend the money from the accounts to have golf outings, buy expensive wine for their wives. Their entire families were going on these trips. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars just in travel.
Now, the head of the hospital's board, I guess, was his executive pay was something close to $800,000 a year.
That's right, and he had perks like unpaid, sort of free loans, no interest loans for health, for insurance, life insurance, things like that. He had incredible perks. And he was also using other board members as his contractors on his own property. So they were completely indebted to him financially. There was a lot of overlap, and there are a lot of questions about the board of that hospital.
Okay, so the doctor and the accountant, they send out this fax, and it starts to get around. Things that the hospital really doesn't want to be publicly known. And so what does the hospital do then next?
Well, the fax was sent out anonymously. They were pretty smart. They knew that they would get slammed by the hospital and by other people. And since everything they were reporting, they looked online at the hospital's financials that are public because it's a nonprofit, and they basically discovered all of these numbers. So they took all the numbers they found, the amount of money the hospital had in the bank, $200 million in cash, the amount of money in the offshore bank accounts, the amount of money that each of them were paid, the perks that they got, the trips that they took, and they wrote them up in something they called the Phoebe factoids, and they sent them out anonymously. And then the hospital was trying to figure out who they were. So they spent a couple $100,000 on investigators just to figure out
The hospital did,
just to figure out who these guys were. And when they couldn't manage it, they enlisted their friend, the local DA, to issue a grand jury subpoena to find out who the guys were. And when he got the information back from the phone company, he discovered who they were, he just handed it over to the hospital, which is...
It doesn't sound legal.
It's unethical. It's not necessarily illegal. It's not something you'd expect from a prosecutor. You're not supposed to work with a private organization. And so he was very helpful to them.
And it also seems odd that they would need offshore accounts in the Caymans. I mean, who needs that unless they're trying to, hide something?
I'm not an expert in this, but apparently it's a very standard practice.
Is it really?
Very standard. It's a way for them to set up insurance for themselves and to have it sort of unregulated in a particular way. So I don't understand it, and I can't really explain it, but it's across the board very, very standard.
Very standard. So that's not in itself fishy. Okay.
It's fishy. It's fishy, but it's standard. All of this is standard.
Standard fishiness. Okay.
The overcharging is standard. All of it is pretty standard.
In getting to know Dr. Bagnato and Charles Rayberg, as I said, they seem like average guys, not the kind of person. And you got to know them making the film. What struck you about them? What was the key, do you think, to their characters that would explain what would make them take a stand? And we'll explain later how big a stand they ended up taking with the hospital.
They're very different people. I think Dr. Bagnato, just felt that he'd done all the research. He's an incredibly thorough person. They both are. And he felt like, this doesn't make sense. What are you doing? We take care of our patients when they don't have the money to pay for something. As a surgery practice, they would, forgive all kinds of bills. But people started coming to him and saying, listen, I'm bankrupt. I'm a hospital employee. I have a lien put on my house.
The hospital employees were going into bankruptcy.
That's right. And the hospital
they got no break on their medical bills either.
No. And there were garnishments. And Bagnato would look at things and say, look at the court records, and there were garnishments for hundreds of people in the town. And this isn't, the hospital didn't have that many employees, and a lot of them were Phoebe employees. And so he just got angry, and he said, this isn't right.
Their employees were almost like medical sharecroppers.
Yeah. That's what he would say. That's right. And he's he feels, I think, he came from a different place than Rayberg because he had the ability to go somewhere else. He's a very well-known surgeon, very successful. And Rayberg is someone who's brought up with all the right values. He's an incredibly ethical person. You do the right thing. You take care of your neighbors. You never stray from that. And when he discovered this, he had been a CFO at a hospital, so he'd actually done some of this billing. And when he began to understand what it was doing to patients, he completely turned around and said, you know what? This is crazy. I want to dig. And he just dug his heels in and said, I'm not going to back down from this. These people are bad.
So Dr. Bagnato basically wasn't afraid of the hospital because he could go anywhere. He didn't have to stick around if the fallout got to be too much. But Rayberg sounds like he was just an incredibly ethical person.
Right, and he had a lot to lose.
Like what?
Yeah. Well, when the hospital actually got these guys prosecuted for harassing telephone calls using the factoids, and they attached this felony charge because an investigator that was protecting Charles Rayberg, I guess we should jump ahead to a little bit more what happened in the story, went to the home of one of the board members, and he claimed that he was assaulted, and that was tied into Rayberg. So the two men were charged with a felony charge of assault. And Rayberg could stand to lose his license if he was convicted. And Bagnado could have too, and it would have ruined them.